Additional to my political hat, I'm a member of the Fatah Revolution Council, and I'm a member of the Palestine National Council, being the uppermost authority, the supreme authority of the Palestine Liberation Organization representing the Palestinian people. I'm also an academic, and I spent a good part of my life as a university teacher. I encourage my students to make mistakes, and I encourage my students not to be fearful of making mistakes. And I try to impress upon my students that making a mistake is an opportunity for learning. And I find myself in the similar situation, although you're not my students, and definitely only in part students. We are still under the auspices of a university, so I'll wear my university cap and point to a mistake that may lead to some clarification. I was introduced as an Israeli something, I don't remember, scholar or militant or member of the Fatah Revolutionary Council, and I insist I am not an Israeli. Well, the mistake is commonplace. Sometimes after a lecture, people gather for some informal conversation, and they ask me where I was born, and I tell people that I was born in Jerusalem in 1943. And those who are less familiar with the history of Palestine then quite often respond, "Oh, so you were born in Israel?" And I really enjoy responding by saying, I was born in Jerusalem and not in Israel. And then quite often the response is rather perplexed. How come? Well, I was born in 1943, and there was no State of Israel in 1943. The State of Israel was established in 1948 as an apartheid state. So, yes, I carry an Israeli passport, and I'm not an Israeli. I also carry a UK passport, a British passport. And in England, I'm a foreigner. But the significance of having an Israeli piece of paper, and that piece of paper is Israeli, it was issued by the apartheid government of the State of Israel, and a British passport, and technically speaking, my sovereign is the Queen of England, I want to underline very emphatically that I have no loyalty to the Queen of England, and I have no loyalty to the apartheid government of the State of Israel. As far as I'm concerned, these two passports do not represent my patriotic sentiment and my patriotic identity. I'm a Palestinian carrying an Israeli passport of Jewish extraction and not an Israeli. And it is this structure that is typical not only of my individual case as an individual citizen of apartheid Israel. You may be aware that 20% of the citizenry of the apartheid state of Israel are Palestinian Arabs, and they carry the same passport as I carry, a passport of the apartheid state of Israel. So the passport is not always a designation of one's patriotic identity. It can be a designation of patriotic identity if the constitution is democratic. And had the constitution of apartheid Israel been democratic, I would have no problem in projecting myself as an Israeli. But first of all, Israel has no constitution. Some of you may know that. And secondly, at core, it is as structured as an apartheid state, identical to the core legal structure of the now happily demised apartheid South Africa. I am of Jewish extraction. My family is Jewish. My father was a British Jew who arrived in Jerusalem in the mid-30s of the previous century. My mother, a Czechoslovak Jew who arrived in Jerusalem at around the same time. They married in 1939, and prior to the establishment of the State of Israel, of course. And in fact, I actually have a Palestinian birth certificate. Title of that document is Government of Palestine. But the question again relating to this particular document is contingent, just as the question of who is a Jew is contingent and contested. The question of who is a Palestinian is contingent and contested. And the common stereotype is that the Palestinian is an Arab. I am happily married in Ramallah, and my university is a Palestinian university called Al-Quds University on the Palestinian side of the apartheid wall in Jerusalem, technically in the locality named Abu Dis. I usually travel by private transport, by cart, by my university, but sometimes by public transport. And these minibuses wait until they fill up. So I enter a minibus, and there is usually 2-3 people in the minibus ahead of me, and we wait for the minibus to fill up. And my telephone rings. And my Arabic is not that bad. So if the interlocutor is an Arabic-speaking person, I answer in Arabic. If the interlocutor is an English-speaking person, I answer in English. And if the interlocutor is an Hebrew-speaking person, well, Hebrew is my mother tongue. So it's usually in Ramallah an Arabic person. And I answer in Arabic. Within a minute or two, one of the people preceding me on the minibus would say, "Who are you?" I mean, after all, it's not that often that a person of Caucasian extraction speaks rather good Arabic. And since my mother tongue is Hebrew, inevitably with an Israeli nuance, accent. And Ramallah is under occupation. And a Caucasian-speaking Arabic with an Israeli nuance could just about be a spy for the Israeli occupation. So I give them, the person who asked the question, the entire rainbow of my titles. I teach at Al-Quds University. I have a British passport. I have an Israeli passport. I'm of Jewish origin. And, well, that's enough, I think. There is one or two more. So within a second or two, there is a smile. Welcome to Palestine. Welcome to Palestine. But then I usually add, but I didn't really give you the central element of this sequence. I'm of Jewish origin, and I'm anti-Zionist. And then, of course, there's a handshake. So who is a Palestinian? The bottom formula that I tell people is, yes, I'm a Palestinian by every standard, legal standard of which I'm aware. I was born in Jerusalem, and birth in Jerusalem in terms of Palestinian law entitles the individual to the term Palestinian. But then if you ignore the fact that it's the country of Palestine between the sea and the Jordan River has been subject to ethnic cleansing and continuing occupation, well, many members of parliament in the Palestinian, in the Knesset, in the Zionist government, were born in Jerusalem. Unless you actually say that you are an anti-Zionist, being born in Jerusalem, any Zionist can claim they were born in Jerusalem, and they will be enemies of the Palestinian people. The question of whether you are Zionist or anti-Zionist decides where you stand. And I am fairly confident of where I stand. The choice is rather simple, and the equations are rather simple. Either the equation is definitely in states governed by apartheid constitutions or countries under occupation, whether your loyalties are with the criminal party or whether your loyalties are with the people crippled by the criminal party. And my loyalties are definitely with the people crippled by the criminal party being apartheid Israel. So, by comparison to the situation of apartheid South Africa in the decades of apartheid, my situation inside the Hebrew society of the State of Israel is very marginal. I'm not that unique, but our position is at the margin of 1, 2, at most 3% of the mainstream Hebrew society in Israel. The majority of the population are pro-Zionist and pro-occupation and pro-occupation. Even if they don't like the occupation, they justify the occupation by one sense or another, and pro-apartheid. But this is not unusual. I mean, you would know from your own experience that the margin of white citizens of South Africa who broke away from the values of apartheid and joined the democratic struggle and the liberation movement also does not, to my understanding, exceed 1, 2, at most 3% of the white population in South Africa. I'm aware, very much aware, that relative to my Palestinian comrades, my hand is in the water. I'm not necessarily because of my autonomous achievements, but by default, due to the apartheid legislation and apartheid segregation, being Caucasian, being of Jewish origin, being a citizen of the apartheid state, being a citizen of the United Kingdom, position me in a situation of inbuilt privilege relative to, well, Palestinian freedom fighters who have been sentenced not just to a lifetime of imprisonment, but to multiplicity of lifetime of imprisonment, and some of them to 20 years or to 10 years or 5 years. I don't know how many of you had the occasion to be in jail for any period of time. It's not an easy experience. And the difficulty that this jail imprisonment impacts on their families and their children. Relative to Palestinians in refugee camps for decades and decades and decades since the establishment of the State of Israel, relative to the mainstream of the Palestinian people, my hand is in the water. And I'm hugely privileged. And people ask me, well, Dr. Davis, you're being a member of the Revolutionary Council and an anti-Zionist, why do you hold on to your Israeli passport? And the answer that I give, and it is my genuine and firm position, that passport that gives me privilege, for instance, for commuting in all parts of the country without being held at checkposts, is, as far as I'm concerned, an important instrument facilitating my contribution to the defense of human rights and defense of Palestinian rights. And as long as it's not taken away from me, I'm going to hold on to it. I introduce myself as being of Jewish origin, and there are a number of reasons to that. One, some would remain private, but one is slightly less private. So I propose to share it with this audience. I noted that my mother is a Jewish person originating in Czechoslovakia, and that the marriage of my parents took place in 1939 in Palestine. In 1939, the Second World War broke out, and the sister of my mother, her children, her husband were transported under the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia to Auschwitz, and they were killed in Auschwitz. And I believe I owe the fact that I address you in these terms basically to my parents, because they taught their children from the word go to not to generalize at no context and in no sense and in no environment, intellectual or otherwise, you do not generalize. In very simple terms, there are good Jews and bad Jews. There are good Arabs and bad Arabs. There are good Britons and bad Britons. There are good Germans and bad Germans. My parents would not have their children say or utter or think that the Germans killed our family. No, Nazis killed our family. And not all Nazis killed our family. A gang of Nazis killed our family. And very early on we were taught to distinguish between the quest for vengeance and the quest for justice. And my parents, and definitely my mother, would spit in the face of any party who suggested an opportunity to apply to the gang of Nazis that killed her sister, her children, her husband, the same measures in revenge. She wouldn't allow revenge denigrate, desecrate her sense of humanity and justice. She sought justice and not vengeance. And I can tell you on the experience, immediate experience of my family environment, and I've been now for half a century at the forefront of defense of human rights and Palestinian rights against a rather hostile environment of an apartheid state. And mostly at the interface, the Hebrew-Arab interface, both inside Palestine and beyond. I did my PhD in the United States, and I taught for 20 years in the United Kingdom, in universities in the United Kingdom. I can assure you on that experience, which is not regarded as an academic experience and academic corroborations. I didn't do the research, I didn't do the survey, but it's a fairly convincing ground for uttering what I'm about to say. After all, half a century is long enough, that the mainstream of the Palestinian people, the mainstream, is a little bit like my mother. They seek justice and not vengeance. At the margin, there are parties seeking vengeance, but the mainstream is a little bit like my mother, seeking justice and not vengeance. And I can only second comments made by the previous speaker, Professor Farid, that victories are to be counted not only in terms of tangible achievement, but in terms of what has happened. And from the privileged point of being 73 years old, I'm confident, absolutely confident, that the struggle for the liberation of Palestine is on the rise and on accelerated rise, very much due to global BDS fantastic interventions. And possibly within my lifetime, I will witness the downfall of Zionism and apartheid Israel and celebrate with you all the victory. Thank you very much.